I'll call on Deputy Catherine Connolly.
First of all, I want to welcome the report. I want to welcome the 42 priority recommendations and the 39 ancillary recommendations. I want to thank the Chairperson, Deputy Naughton, my own colleague in Galway West, and also all the members of the committee and my colleague Thomas Pringle, who represented Independence for Change. Having got all of that out of the way, I think it's important to put all that positivity, which is wonderful, in context. And if we go back to 1988, where this started with the first intergovernmental conference 32 years ago, and followed on, and all of the time our emissions have increased. We've had the Kyoto Protocol brought in 1997, came into operation in 2005. We jumped forward to the Paris Agreement with binding targets. And then we come to Ireland. We've had a white paper. I'm not sure if we had a green paper. We've had the actual legislation. We've had a mitigation plan. We've had a framework plan. And we've set up the Advisory Council. So, Ministers and Deputy Chairperson, Chair of the Committee, I think we have to acknowledge that this Dáil has been led screaming, led by the nose, to do something about climate change. It hasn't come from the Dáil. It certainly has come from the opposition with new politics since February 2016. And I welcome that the government has come along with us in that new lead. And we've been forced by the children of the world, the children of Ireland, and we've been forced by the Citizens' Assembly to take action. That's what's happening here. This is a very good report, although I have the same reservations about which I'll come back to in relation to a carbon tax and using that to divide and conquer and losing the whole point of what we're trying to do here in relation to climate change. If we look, and Deputy Smith has mentioned a number of reports, it would be remiss of me, and actually I can only cope with the summary, because the summary is extensive, of the recent biodiversity report, or should I say the lack of biodiversity, and the summary makes for very grim reading. Summary for policymakers of the Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, unedited advanced version. And the UN commissioned report, the summary of which was approved at the 7th session in Paris last week, is the most comprehensive report on the issue ever completed, compiled by 145 expert authors from 50 countries over the past 3 years, with inputs from over 310 contributing authors. The report finds, and I'm going to say it slowly, that approximately 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction. 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, many within decades, more than ever before in human history. The average abundance of native species in most major land-based habitats has fallen by at least 20%. More than 40% of amphibian species, almost 33% of reef-forming corals, and more than a third of all marine mammals are threatened. I hasten to add that only a small number of rich, developed countries have led to this disaster, and Ireland, unfortunately, is one of those countries. The Intergovernmental Panel, the latest report in October 18, confirmed, Ministers, that we've only 12 years left for global warming to be kept to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which even a half a degree will significantly worsen the risks of drought, floods, extreme heat and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. And most of those people have done absolutely nothing wrong. Rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society are essential to prevent catastrophic climate change. The latest report from the Wildlife Fund tells us that the EU consumes almost 20% of the Earth's biocapacity, although it comprises only 7% of the world population. EU, I'm going to repeat, consumes almost 20%, the EU, of the Earth's biocapacity, although it comprises only 7% of the world population. And our role in that is, I understand, subject to correction, that Ireland is currently the third highest carbon emitter in the EU. We've had the Climate Change Advisory Council produced its first report in November 2016, and they have pointed out that we're failing to meet our targets. The EPA has spoken out and highlighted that we're failing to meet our targets. Today, earlier on, we talked about a national broadband plan, and we noted for the first time that the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform mentioned climate change, and that if you go ahead with the broadband plan in the manner that you plan to do, it will have huge and significant effects on many, many areas, including our ability to take climate change action. In relation to the report itself, I welcome the fact that there's going to be a committee. The recommendation is to set up a committee to monitor the implementation of the priority recommendations and the ancillary recommendations. That is absolutely essential. Perhaps I'm being a bit unfair on you when in the way that the motion is put, because I realise that's the language to note the report. Well, the report was laid before the Dáil on the 29th of March. Since then, as I've quoted from the Biodiversity report, we know from each report that things are getting worse. So I would have thought that the government might have seen sense and moved on from the gentle language of taking note to taking action. And I welcome the amendments put in by Fianna Fáil, the Green Party, and People Before Profit in relation to declaring an emergency. I support that, and also Sinn Féin. Minister, we have to take action, and before we take action, exactly like with housing, we have to recognise the problem, and that will determine the speed of our actions. In relation to the chapters itself, there are too many to go through in the few minutes that are left, but I note the 10 chapters, and in particular I'm just going to look at chapter 10 on transport for a few minutes. And in relation to that, there are many, many good suggestions, including that you pick one particular city as a pilot project. Now, interestingly enough, it only appears once, but it's a very strong recommendation on page 97 and 6C. To develop a pilot scheme for a city and its regional hinterland to develop a best practice model. Now, I certainly welcome that, and I would suggest Galway City, and I see somewhere else in the report you talk about cities over a certain population, and Galway is an absolute very good example of a city that could be picked to implement climate change measures very quickly, particularly in terms of public transport. Our population is 80,000 and destined to grow by another 50%. That's all set out in the national planning, in the national plan and the national planning framework. You talk about sustainability through it all, yet you talk about a provision of another road and more traffic, which goes completely against your own recommendations in this report and goes completely against the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly, who have asked you, and you've endorsed, as I understand it, subject to correction, you have endorsed all of the recommendations from the Citizens' Assembly, which ask you to rebalance the money being spent on roads and put it in favour of public transport. And so if we look at Galway again, immediately we could implement Park and Ride. It's in a city development plan since 2005, 5 from 19, 14 years later, not a sign of Park and Ride. Can you imagine, in a city of 80,000 people, no Park and Ride, and picked out as one of the 5 cities to grow? Our bike infrastructure is minimal in Galway and could be immediately improved with very little effort. We have no biodiversity officer. We have what the report I read out, and we have no biodiversity officer in Galway. These are very practical measures, Minister. If you're seriously interested, it could be done in a very short space of time. The retrofitting of houses, as has been suggested, should start immediately with the houses owned by the local authority and retrofit them. In relation to another example of sort of very good ideas on the one hand coming from the government, albeit with sustained pressure from the opposition, on the other hand doing the opposite. And so if we look at Galway City, a very successful cash for cans that has been operating for a number of years now. And so you bring back the aluminium cans and you get a small return for your money. Minister, they've actually suspended it. And one of the reasons they've suspended that is because they believe the polluter should pay. Can you imagine that for inverted logic? You have people willingly going forward to the council, picking up the aluminium cans, and they've actually suspended it. Now, that's just small and parochial on one level, but it illustrates the double think that's coming from the government. So I'll finish. I think my time is up because the clock is gone. I'm not sure what's left. Is my time up? Just in relation to the carbon tax, I feel that it's absolutely divisive. I feel that you're going to divide people from each other, which is most unnecessary, because the people are united in their demand that we do something about climate change at a national level and then work down. We have to show the way in this stall and through the government. Zoning in on a carbon tax for those that can least afford to pay, you're in danger of repeating the debacle of the water charges. And I would ask you to learn from that. We have no time left. We need to take serious, urgent action in so many aspects together. So let's agree on what we can agree on and take action, and let's not divide and conquer. Garamagat.